food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.
Michael Greger, MD, is the Director of Public Health and Animal Agriculture at the Humane Society of the United States. He's a physician, he's an author, he's a well-renowned speaker, and his latest book, Bird Flu, A Virus of Our Own Hatching, will be out this summer. Actually, this is an old bio. The book is out on our desk. And Doctor would be more than happy to sign the books for you after his lecture. Dr. Greger is also a graduate of the Cornell University School of Agriculture and the Tufts University School of Medicine. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Greger.
(1981). Ronald Reagan takes the oath. MTV starts broadcasting Indiana Jones, and Pac-Man Mania is all the rage. In June, the CDC released a tiny bulletin. 5 men in Los Angeles, it seems, were dying with a strange cluster of symptoms. From humble beginnings, AIDS has since killed 25 million people. Now, the spread of the AIDS virus has been certainly facilitated by promiscuity, IV drug use, blood banking, but where did this virus come from in the first place? And of course, AIDS is not our only new disease. There's a whole long list of emerging infectious diseases: SARS, Ebola, mad cow, bird flu. But from where do emerging diseases emerge? Let's go back, way back. Human beings have been on this earth for millions of years, yet throughout most of human evolution, there were no epidemic diseases. No one ever got tuberculosis because tuberculosis didn't exist. No one ever got the measles, no one ever got the flu, not even the common cold until here, about 10,000 years ago. The Smithsonian has identified 3 major periods of disease since the beginning of human evolution, and the first started just 10,000 years ago with the domestication of animals. When we brought animals into the barnyard, they brought their diseases with them. So, for example, we domesticated goats, and they in turn gave us tuberculosis, which in the last century has killed 100 million people, and is today killing more people than ever before. What started out in goats now infects 1/3 of humanity. When we first domesticated cattle, we also domesticated the rinderpest virus, which turned into human measles. We tend to think of measles as a relatively benign disease, but over the last 150 years, measles has killed 200 million people. And in a sense, all of those deaths can ultimately be traced back just a few hundred generations to the taming of the first cattle. Smallpox, also thought to have been a mutant cattle virus. We domesticated pigs and got whooping cough. We domesticated chickens and got typhoid fever and typhoid Mary. We domesticated ducks and got influenza. Before the domestication of ducks, no one ever got the flu. Leprosy came from water buffalo, and the common cold from horses. How often did wild horses have the opportunity to sneeze into humanity's collective face until they were broken and bridled? Right? Until then, the common cold was presumably only common to them. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, Professor Diamond tried to explain why the diseases of the landing Europeans wiped out 95% of the Native Americans instead of the other way around. Why didn't Native American plagues kill the Europeans? Because there were no plagues. In his chapter, Lethal Gift of Livestock, he explains how there was no tuberculosis in the Americas because there were no goats in the Americas. They had buffalo, but no domesticated buffalo, so no measles, no smallpox. No pigs, so no pertussis. No chickens, so no typhoid. So while people were dying by the millions of killer scourges in Europe and Asia, none were dying in the so-called New World because there weren't any farm animals to domesticate. There wasn't this spillover of animal disease. The second great era of human disease started just a few hundred years ago with the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries, which resulted in an epidemic of the so-called diseases of industrialization: obesity, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, etc. But by the mid-20th century, the age of infectious disease was thought to be over. The 1968, the U.S. Surgeon General declared, "The war against infectious disease has been won." In 1975, the Dean of Yale School of Medicine pronounced that there were no new diseases to be discovered. Except maybe lung cancer, if you can see that. Even Nobel laureates were seduced into the heady optimism of the time. One famous virologist wrote in a 1962 textbook, to write about infectious diseases almost to write about something that has passed into history. The most likely forecast for the future of infectious disease, he concluded, is that it will be very dull. But then, something changed. After decades of declining infectious disease mortality in the United States, the trend has reversed over the last 30 years or so. This is a graph from the CDC of infectious disease mortality over time, over the last 50 years or so. Declining. 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 But then around 1975, it started to go back up. The number of Americans dying from infectious disease started to go back up. Since 1975, new diseases have emerged and re-emerged at a rate unheard of in the annals of medicine. More than 30 new diseases in 30 years, mostly newly discovered viruses. In fact, the whole concept of emerging infectious disease used to be a mere curiosity in the field of medicine. Now has moved to center stage. We may soon be facing, according to the U.S. Institute of Medicine, a catastrophic storm of microbial threats. We are now smack dab in the third era of human disease, which according to the Smithsonian started only about 30 years ago. Medical historians have called this time in which we live the age of emerging plagues, almost all of which come from animals. But we domesticated animals 10,000 years ago. What has changed in recent years to bring this all upon us? Well, we are changing the way animals live. Take Connecticut, for example, where, in 1975, Lyme disease was first recognized, since spread across all 50 states, affecting an estimated 100,000 Americans since its emergence. Now, Lyme disease is caused by bacteria-infested deer ticks, but the primary host is actually not deer, but this little guy here, the white-footed mouse. The ticks themselves, not quite as cute, but we've been sharing the woods with these fellas forever. What happened recently was suburbia. The black-legged ticks live on the white-footed mouse, kept at bay by woodland predators, but then developers moved in and chopped up America's woodlands into subdivisions, scaring away the foxes and bobcats. Now we have more mice, more ticks, and more disease. We are changing the way animals live. Going back even farther, with the main cattle-producing nations fighting during the Second World War, Argentina took advantage of the situation by dramatically expanding its beef industry at the expense of its rainforest. There we discovered the deadly Hunan virus, or rather it discovered us. The so-called hamburgerization of the tropical rainforest exposed hemorrhagic fever viruses all across the continent. Turning to the other side of the world, sawing into Africa's rainforest exposed other hemorrhagic fever viruses such as the Lassa virus, Rift Valley fever, and of course, Ebola. Now, the inroads into Africa's rainforest were logging roads built by transnational timber corporations hacking deep into the rainforest, dragging along a hungry migrant workforce who survived on bushmeat, wild animals killed for food, which includes upwards of 26 different species of primates, including thousands of endangered great apes, such as chimpanzees and gorillas, who are shot, butchered, smoked, and sold as food. Now, by cannibalizing our fellow primates, we are exposing ourselves to viruses particularly fine-tuned to our own primate physiology. In fact, recent outbreaks of Ebola, for example, were traced to exposure to infected great apes hunted for food. Now, Ebola is one of humanity's deadliest infections, but is not efficiently spread compared to a disease like AIDS. The leading theory as to the emergence of the AIDS virus is direct exposure to animal blood and secretions as a result of hunting, butchering, and the consumption of contaminated meat. The experts believe that kind of the leading hypothesis is that human beings got HIV by kind of sawing their way through the jungles, butchering chimpanzees for their flesh along the way. In some countries, the prevalence of HIV now exceeds 25% of the adult population, leaving millions of orphan children in its wake. Someone butchered a chimp a few decades ago, and now 25 million people are dead. Now, we've been hunting wildlife for thousands of years, though, but never before like this, with demand for wildlife meat outstripping local supply. What countries have done is set up these intensive captive production farms, cramming wild animals in these cramped, filthy cages and then smuggling them around the world. Now, this intensive commercial bushmeat trade actually started in the live markets of Asia, particularly the Guangdong province surrounding Hong Kong, from which the current bird flu threat arose. The civet cat, popular commodity in these Chinese animal markets. In addition to being raised for their flesh, they also produce the most expensive coffee in the world. So-called fox dung coffee is produced by feeding coffee beans to captive civets and then, you guessed it, recovering the partially digested beans from their feces, a musk-like substance of buttery consistency secreted by the anal glands is said to give this coffee its distinctive flavor. One might say this unique drink is good to the last dropping. The civet cat, blamed for the SARS epidemic from the medical journal The Lancet, a culinary choice in South China. A culinary choice in South China led to a fatal infection in Hong Kong, subsequently 8,000 cases of SARS, nearly 1,000 deaths, 30 countries, 6 continents. Maybe they should have just stuck to Starbucks. These live animal markets took a class of viruses known only for causing the common cold, coronaviruses, and turned them into a killer, SARS, which then spread around the globe. Now, viruses can escape the rainforests in animals live or dead as pets or as meat. In 2003, the exotic pet trade brought monkeypox from the jungles of West Africa to Wisconsin. Bird smuggling may have actually been what brought the West Nile virus to the Western Hemisphere. Here it hits New York in '99. Since spread across the country, thousands of cases last year, nearly 100 deaths, all perhaps of a single imported pet bird. Okay, so we are changing the way animals live, causing new diseases. But there's one way we have changed our relationship with animals that really outshadows all the rest. In 2004, the world's three leading authorities, the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Organization for Animal Health, the leading veterinary authority on the planet, got together to uncover the key underlying causes for this age of emerging plagues. They came up with four main risk factors for the emergence and spread of these new diseases. Yes, they mentioned bushmeat and the exotic pet trade, but number one on their list was this increasing demand for animal protein around the world. Yes, we domesticated animals 10,000 years ago, but never before like this, particularly pigs and poultry. Chickens used to be pecking around the barnyard, but now chickens raised for meat are typically warehoused in these sheds that can contain tens of thousands of birds. Most egg-laying hens in the world are now confined in battery cages, these small barren wire enclosures extending down long rows in windowless sheds. Can be up to 1 million birds on one farm. It's about where 98% of our eggs come from. Most pigs in the world now are again confined in these intensive production conditions. Old MacDonald's farm got replaced by the new McDonald's farm. These intensive systems represent the most profound alteration of the human-animal relationship in 10,000 years. And no surprise, they are breeding grounds for disease. A few snapshots. China, 2005. Last year, the world's largest pork producer suffered an unprecedented outbreak of an emerging pig pathogen, strep suis, causing meningitis and deafness in people that handle infected pork products. The worst outbreak ever of the deadliest strain ever. Why? Well, the World Health Organization blamed these intensive confinement conditions. The USDA elaborates, seems all strep suis starts out harmless, asymptomatic, normal gut flora, but stress due to overcrowding and inadequate ventilation causes this bug to go invasive, causing infections of the brain, blood, lungs, heart, and death. Starts out harmless, turns deadly. That's what these kind of conditions can do. This is not how animals were supposed to live. Pig factories in Malaysia birthed the Nipah virus, one of the deadliest of human infections, causing relapsing brain infections in people who are infected, killing about 40% of those infected, propelling it onto the official U.S. list of bioterrorism agents. And again, the director of the government Harvard Hopkins Tufts Medical Consortium feels that indeed it's again the conditions in which we are keeping these animals that may be to blame. These are diseases of intensification. We took natural herbivores like cows and sheep, turned them into cannibals and carnivores by feeding them slaughterhouse waste, blood, and manure, and then we took downed animals, too sick to even stand, fed them to people in the United States, and now we have mad cow disease. We feed antibiotics by the truckload to farm animals. This is how much antibiotics are used for all of human medicine every year. Now contrast that with the amount fed to farm animals, not even to prevent or treat disease, just to promote growth in such a stressful and filthy environment. Millions of pounds a year. And now we have the antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and we as physicians are really running out of antibiotic options. The scientists at NYU traced the path of these so-called superbugs, starting with the mass feeding of the Cipro class of antibiotics to chickens. Then there's fecal contamination of the carcass at slaughter. There's and then we buy meat at the supermarket polluted with fecal material, leading to longer and more severe human infections. In fact, this was really just cinched last month by the CDC. November 2006, the Journal of Infectious Diseases, the CDC finally released this study. They spent $1 million over 3 years doing rectal swabs of newly admitted hospital patients, both meat eaters and vegetarians, and this is what they found. Now, these were not just vegetarians. These were people who had no contact with fresh or frozen poultry products, so they weren't like preparing meat for a spouse or something. But basically, as you can see here, those that did not handle poultry products had essentially zero growth of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria in their bodies. But at least these so-called superbugs aren't efficiently transmitted from one person to the next. Given the seeming propensity of industrial animal agriculture to churn out these novel, lethal human pathogens, what if these animal factories produced a virus capable of a global pandemic of disease? Let me put these new animal disease threats in perspective. SARS infected thousands, killed hundreds. Nipah infected hundreds, killed scores. Strep suis only infected scores, only killed dozens. Now, AIDS has infected millions of people, but there's only one virus on the planet capable of infecting billions, and that's influenza. Influenza, the so-called last great plague of man, is considered the only pathogen capable of truly global catastrophe. Unlike other deadly diseases like malaria, which are largely confined at the equator, or HIV, which is only fluid-borne, the influenza virus is considered the only pathogen capable of infecting literally half of humanity within a matter of months. Now, in the 4,500 years we've had the flu, since we first domesticated birds, influenza has always been one of our most contagious known diseases, but only since the emergence of this deadly Asian mutant strain H5N1 has it also emerged as one of the deadliest. H5N1, spreading out of Asia here 2004, 2005, 2006, has only killed about 150 people. Now, not to minimize, each death is a terrible tragedy. But in a world in which millions continue to die of diseases like AIDS and tuberculosis, why is there so much concern about this so-called bird flu? Because it's happened before. Because an influenza pandemic in 1918, triggered by a bird flu-like virus, became the worst plague in human history. Modern flu strains tend to spare young, healthy adults, but the 1918 virus killed people in the prime of life. In 1918, a quarter of all Americans fell ill. This is a graph of percentage of population dying. The first civilian casualty was actually September 11, 1918. This is week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. And this is 1918. We're talking steam locomotive here. Los Alamos recently ran a simulation through their supercomputer to see how a pandemic might spread today in the age of commercial airline travel, particularly in a place like Hawaii, which has 7 million visitors every year, 2 million of which from Asia. Here it hits LA, and in a few weeks, the entire country is blanketed. In 1918, 50 to 100 million people lost their lives. A similar virus today could kill many, many more. What started out for millions across the globe as muscle aches and a fever, ended days or even just hours later with many victims bleeding from their eyes, ears, nostrils, and into their lungs. Homeless orphans their parents dead, wandered the empty streets. One agonized official in the stricken East sent an urgent warning west. Quote, "Hunt up your woodworkers and set them to making coffins. Then take your street laborers and set them to digging graves." This is a clipping from the New York Times at the time. Victims of plague everywhere, great pyres of bodies consumed by the flames. Many victims strangled in their own bloody fluids. Their corpses, tinged blue from suffocation, were said to have been stacked like cordwood outside of morgues as cities ran out of coffins. So they dug mass graves. That bird flu originating virus killed more people in 25 weeks than AIDS has killed in 25 years. No war, no plague, no famine has ever killed so many people in so short a time as the 1918 pandemic. Yet in 1918, the mortality rate of the disease was less than 5%. This estimate here, potentially hundreds of millions of people dead in the next pandemic, is based on that same 2 to 3% mortality rate. The H5N1 has officially killed over half of its human victims. In 2006, it's more like 2/3 of people who have gotten it have died. We don't even get a coin toss as to whether or not we live through this disease. Dr. Robert Webster, the world's leading authority on bird flu.
Back to 1918, 2.5% of people died. How many people are dying with bird flu? 50%. We've never seen such an event since the time of the plagues.
Up to 60 million Americans come down with the flu every year. What if it suddenly turned deadly? That's what keeps everyone up at night. The possibility, however slight, that a virus like H5N1 could trigger a human pandemic. That would be like combining one of the most contagious known diseases, influenza, with one of the deadliest. Like crossing a disease like Ebola with the common cold. Where did this virus come from? Well, the dialogue surrounding avian influenza speaks of a potential H5N1 pandemic as if it were a natural disaster. Hurricane, earthquake, over which we couldn't possibly have control. But the reality is that the next pandemic may be more of an unnatural disaster of our own making. In poultry, bird flu has gone from an exceedingly rare disease to one which now pops up every year. The number of outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza in the first few years of this century has already exceeded the total number of outbreaks recorded for the entire 20th century. Now these are in 5-year intervals. In just the first 5 months of this year, we were already up to here. Bird flu seems to be undergoing evolution and fast forward. As one leading flu scientist said, we've gone from a few snowflakes to an avalanche. Along with increasing outbreaks in poultry, there's been increased transmission to humans. Now, 10 years ago, not a single person was known to have gotten directly sick from bird flu, but since 1997, when H5N1 arose, 4 other chicken flu viruses have infected people from Hong Kong all the way to New York City. In the Netherlands outbreak, 1,000 people were infected, with symptomatic poultry workers passing the virus on to a whopping 59% of household family members, human-to-human transmission. 10 years ago, essentially not a single human illness, and now there's been over 1,000 infections in continents around the world. Now, in the Netherlands outbreak, 30 million chickens died, but only one person, one of the veterinarians, died. See, the Netherlands bird flu virus was good at spreading, but not at killing. H5N1 is the opposite. Now, H5N1 isn't even good at spreading from birds to people. Look, 150 deaths in 9 years. And certainly not good at spreading from person to person. But the human lethality of H5N1 is ferocious, 10 times deadlier than the worst flu virus on record, that which triggered the pandemic of 1918. So what the Netherlands outbreak showed us in 2003 is that bird flu can evolve to go directly human to human. And what H5N1 shows us is that bird flu can evolve into an efficient human killer. If this trend is allowed to continue, our nightmare may one day be realized. The worst of both worlds, contagious and deadly. So to slow down or stop this rapid recent emergence of highly pathogenic viruses, we must first understand what triggered this avalanche in the first place. What has changed in recent years to kind of bring us to this current crisis? Well, the emergence of H5N1 has been blamed on free-ranging flocks and wild birds. You know, people have been keeping chickens in their backyards for thousands of years, and birds have been migrating for millions. I mean, bird flu has been around forever. What turned bird flu into a killer? Well, that question was recently posed by the senior correspondent with NewsHour with Jim Lehrer to Dr. Webster, the so-called godfather of flu research. Was there something qualitatively different about this last decade? Made it possible for this disease to do something it's never done before? Some kind of change in conditions that suddenly lit a match to the tinder? Webster replied. He said, farming practices have changed. He grew up on a farm. But now we put millions of chickens into a chicken factory next door to a pig factory. And this virus has the opportunity to get into one of these chicken factories and make billions and billions of these mutations continuously. And so what we've changed is the way we raise animals. In our interaction with those animals, now the virus is finding a way out of the animal factories into wild birds. That's what's changed. We've changed the way we raise animals. The big shift in the ecology of avian influenza has been this intensification of the global poultry sector. The number of chickens we now slaughter every day, spread wing to wing, would wrap more than twice around the world's equator. Over the last few decades, meat and egg consumption has exploded in the developing world, leading to these industrial-scale commercial chicken facilities, the perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of new super strains of influenza. This was then, this is now. We cram tens of thousands of birds in these filthy football field-sized sheds to lie beak to beak in their own waste, a veritable breeding ground for disease. However cheap the chicken, it may not be worth the risk. The World Health Organization blames the emergence of H5N1, SARS, Nipah, all these new deadly emerging Asian viruses in part on the overconsumption of animal products and this intensive animal agriculture. The Food and Agriculture Organization starts out, there seems to be an acceleration of human influenza problems over recent years. This is what they mean. This is from the World Health Organization. These are all the new influenza viruses infecting human beings over the last century. Now, turn your attention to just 1995 on. Seems to be kind of a snowflake to an avalanche in people, too. But why? According to the world's leading agriculture authority, this is expected to largely relate to the intensification of poultry production, possibly pig production as well. They elaborate an internal FAO document. Chicken-to-chicken spread, particularly assisted by these intensive husbandry conditions, promotes the virus to shift to a more severe, highly pathogenic type of infection. These conditions favor the rapid spread and so-called hotting up of the virus from low pathogenicity, harmless, to highly pathogenic types. In fact, in this diagram, they actually trace the path of a human pandemic, starting with increased demand for poultry products, and then ending up with a virus capable of human-to-human transmission. In fact, the United Nations has actually called on all governments to fight the role of what they call factory farming, quoting from a UN press release. Governments, local authorities, international agencies need to take a greatly increased role in combating the role of factory farming, which combined with these live bird markets provide ideal conditions for the virus to spread and mutate into a more dangerous form. These factory farms can be thought of as a public health menace. Let me explain how this works. All bird flu viruses start out harmless to both birds and people. Very important to understand. They start out harmless. Avian influenza viruses have existed for millions of years as an intestinal, waterborne infection of aquatic birds like ducks. So, well, what's a duck's intestinal bug doing in a human cough? Well, in humans, the virus must make us sick in order to spread. It must make us cough in order to shoot virus from one person to the next. But in the virus's natural reservoir, the virus doesn't need to make the duck sick in order to spread. In fact, it's in the virus's best interest not to make the duck sick, as dead ducks don't fly very far. So the virus silently multiplies in the duck's intestinal lining, is excreted into the pond water, swallowed up by another duck, and the cycle continues as it has for millions of years, and no one gets hurt. But if an infected duck is dragged to a live bird market, for example, crammed in cages high enough to splatter virus-infected feces on land-based birds, terrestrial birds like chickens, then the virus has got a problem. Like a fish out of water, when the virus finds itself in the gut of a chicken, no longer has the luxury of easy waterborne spread. Chickens aren't paddling around in the pond, right? So the virus must mutate or die. In fact, unfortunately for us, mutating is what influenza viruses seem to do best. So in its natural reservoir, it's in total evolutionary stasis. But when thrown into new hosts, land-based birds, it quickly starts mutating to adapt to its new hosts. In the open air, it must resist dehydration, for example, and may have to travel to new organs to find a different way to spread. The intestines ain't going to work no more. And it may find the lungs, which is bad news for human beings. In a chicken, the more virulent, the more violent the virus becomes, the quicker it may be able to overwhelm the immune system of its new host, these chickens. But if it becomes too dangerous, too virulent, then it may kill the animal before it has a chance to spread. It may not spread as far. And in an outdoor setting, at least, if the virus kills its host too quickly, it may not have a chance to spread to others. So in nature, there's kind of a limit to how virulent these viruses can get. Or at least there was until now. Enter intensive poultry production. When the next beak is just inches away, there may be no limit to how nasty these viruses can get. Evolutionary biologists refer to this as the key to the emergence of hypervirulent, so-called predator-type viruses, like H5N1. Transmission from immobilized hosts. So when you have a situation where the healthy cannot escape the diseased, where the virus can just knock you flat and still transmit to someone else just because it's so crowded, then there may be no stopping rapidly mutating viruses from becoming truly ferocious. This would explain the virus of 1918, rising out of the trenches of World War I. There were these crowded troop transporters. Boxcars were labeled 8 horses or 40 men, crammed in just like the chickens. So when this harmless virus found itself in these kind of conditions, it turned deadly. Millions of soldiers forced together in these stressful, unhygienic conditions where there's no escaping a sick comrade. This is thought to be where the virus of 1918 gained its virulence. And from the point of view of this virus, these same trench warfare conditions exist today in every industrial chicken shed, every industrial egg operation. Confined, crowded, stressed, but by the billions, not just millions. Last year, a trade journal offered a concise explanation of how the role of these large production facilities. Bird flu virus exists harmlessly in ducks, but if the duck flu passes to chickens, it can mutate to a deadly, highly pathogenic strain, spreads rapidly, high mortality, and the larger the flocks, the more intensive the production level, the more scope there is for this virus to mutate. The industry is slowly waking up to what they call the growing realization that viruses previously harmless to natural host species have in all probability become more virulent by passage through these large commercial populations. Starts out harmless, turns deadly. That's what these kind of conditions can do. This is not how animals were supposed to live. How does the poultry industry feel about the possibility that its own factory farms could trigger a global pandemic of human disease? Well, the executive editor of Poultry Magazine wrote an editorial on just that subject last year. The prospect of a virulent flu to which we have absolutely no resistance is frightening. However, to me, the threat is much greater to the poultry industry. I'm not as worried about the U.S. human population dying from bird flu as I am that there will be no chicken to eat. And this is how the U.S. Department of Interior conceives it. Domesticated poultry as the necessary stepping stone to create a pandemic strain of influenza. Now, we used to think pigs were a kind of a vital part of this chain, so this probably not a good idea. But H5N1 has learned not only how to kill people directly, but seems to have gone full circle, escaped from the chicken factories, reinfected its natural host, migratory aquatic birds, who could potentially fly this factory farm virus to continents around the world. Now, unfortunately for us, through some quirk of evolution, the respiratory tracts of chickens seems to bear a striking resemblance to our own primate respiratory tracts on a molecular level, on a virus receptor level. So as the virus gets better at infecting and killing chickens, it may be getting better at infecting and killing us. Virologist Earl Brown, specialist in the evolution of influenza viruses, you have to say high-intensity chicken rearing, Dr. Brown, conclude perfect environment for the generation, again, of this virulent avian flu virus. Now, in contrast, there has never been the emergence of a highly pathogenic flu viruses in chickens kept outside. Never once have a dangerous, deadly virus emerged that we know of from an outdoor chicken flock. Now, of course, you can breed a deadly virus here. It can escape, infect backyard birds, free-range flocks, even wild birds. But that transformation from harmless to deadly always seems to happen in these kind of conditions because of the overcrowding. Remember, transmission from immobilized hosts, because of the sheer numbers, because of the lack of ventilation, no fresh air, and the dankness helps keep the virus alive. Because of the stress crippling their immune systems, because of the filth and the viruses in the feces that they're living in, which are decomposing, releasing ammonia, burning their respiratory tracts, predisposing them to respiratory infection in the first place, and because there's no sunlight. The UV rays in sunlight are actually quite effective in destroying the influenza virus. You put all these factors together, and what you have is the perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of new superstrains of influenza. So to lower our risk of generating increasingly dangerous bird flu viruses, the global industrial poultry industry must reverse course away from greater intensification. But what about biosecurity? I mean, don't we want all the birds crammed inside so they don't have any contact with their, wild bird cousin virus neighbors, I mean, does it matter if these conditions can take a harmless virus, turn it into a deadly virus, if the harmless virus can't get inside in the first place? Unfortunately, Studies have uncovered widespread disregard for the so-called biosecurity, even in the United States, which claims to have the best biosecurity in the world. According to North Carolina State University professor of poultry health management, the standards, high biosecurity, are still wishful thinking in many areas of intensive poultry production. In fact, an outbreak of bird flu in Virginia in 2002 left 4 million birds dead, found its way inside 200 of these so-called biosecure farms, highlighting just how wishful the thinking is that industrial poultry populations are somehow protected. Based on this rapid spread of bird flu in the U.S. in 2002, USDA poultry virologists conclude the obvious, and that is that biosecurity on many farms is simply inadequate. Researchers at the University of Maryland surveyed commercial chicken facilities throughout the Delmarva Peninsula near me in D.C., perhaps the densest concentration of chickens in the world, 100 million chickens there at any one time, and concluded that U.S. chicken flocks constantly at risk of infection triggered by these poor biosecurity practices. See, H5N1 is considered a biosafety level 3+ pathogen. That means that in a laboratory setting, this virus must only be handled in these high containment facilities, special engineered with airlocks, double door access, shower in, shower out, single pass airflow, all floors, walls, ceilings are waterproof, sealed, all wall penetrations, electric outlets, foam cords caulked, collared, sealed to prevent any air leaks. All surfaces decontaminated daily, all solid waste incinerated. That's how you're supposed to handle this virus. That's biosecurity. In contrast, the industrial poultry industry seems to be breeding viruses like H5N1 at essentially biosafety level 0. So the poultry industry is not only playing with fire, with no way to put it out, they are fanning the flames, and firewalls to contain this virus do not seem to exist. Unfortunately, concluded probably USDA's leading poultry virologist talking to an international gathering of bird flu scientists, unfortunately this level of biosecurity does not exist in U.S. poultry production. Frankly, he doubts it exists anywhere in the world. And, according to emeritus veterinary poultry professor, author of Handbook of Life of Poultry Diseases, biosecurity standards may actually be in decline in order for the industry to cut costs. Ken Rudd, in Poultry Digest, biosecurity measures as currently practiced may be better than nothing, but may not be something we want to stake the lives of millions of people upon for the sake of cheap chicken. A pandemic triggered by H5N1 or some comparable future bird flu virus has the capacity to potentially trigger one of the greatest human catastrophes of all time. It would seem wiser, more prudent to move away from industrial poultry production altogether, or at least stop encouraging its movement into the developing world. Ken Rudd, in Poultry Digest, Ken Rudd, longtime industry insider, avian health expert, wrote a very candid article called Poultry Reality Check Needed, which he laid out the skewed priorities of his industry. Drawing on his 39 years experience within the poultry industry, he concluded his article with these prophetic words. He said, "Now is the time to decide. We can go on with business as usual, charging headlong towards lower costs, or we can begin making the prudent moves necessary to restore a balance between economics and long-range avian health. We can pay now, or we can pay later, but it should be known, and it must be said, one way or another, we will pay." Combating the role of factory farming, as the United Nations advised, may indeed prevent future bird flu virus outbreaks, but H5N1 has already been hatched, already spread and mutated into a more dangerous form, and there seems little hope in eradicating it now that it's become entrenched into the actual ecology, into wild bird populations throughout half the planet. Dr. Michael Osterholm is the director of the U.S. Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, an associate director within the Department of Homeland Security. He tried to describe what an H5N1 pandemic could look like in probably our nation's leading public policy journal called Foreign Affairs. He asked policymakers to consider the devastation of the 2004 tsunami in South Asia. He said, duplicate the tsunami in every major center and rural community around the planet simultaneously. Add in the paralyzing fear and panic of contagion, and we begin to get some sense of the potential of pandemic influenza. That's what he thinks it could be like. A tsunami in every city, every town, everywhere, people drowning in their own bloody fluids. Or if we prefer, Katrina. Imagine every city, New Orleans, around the world at the same time. All perhaps because people insisted on eating cheaper chicken. The next pandemic may be more of an unnatural disaster of our own making. An influenza pandemic of even moderate impact will result in the single biggest human disaster ever, far greater than AIDS, 9/11, all the wars of the 20th century, and the recent tsunami combined. Has the potential to redirect world history as the Black Death redirected European history during the 14th century. Hopefully the direction world history will take is away from raising birds by the billions under intensive confinement to potentially lower our risk of us ever being in this precarious position ever again. So for the future, we fight these factory farms. For right now, the CDC has set up an excellent pandemic preparedness website, pandemicflu.gov. If you click across here, you will find pandemic preparedness checklist for schools, for businesses, faith-based groups, all the way down to individual and family preparation, which really focuses on stockpiling weeks of essential supplies, including companion animals, of course, in that preparation as well. I know not everyone has access to the internet, so I do have copies of this important checklist out, as well as for yourself and your pets as well. In terms of medical options, we don't expect to have a workable vaccine within months of a pandemic striking, but there are two classes of antiviral treatment drugs. Not vaccines, but actual drugs you can take once you fall ill. We didn't have those back in 1918. Unfortunately, as reported last year, we have lost half our options. Bird flu drug rendered useless. Why? Because the Chinese chicken farmers were feeding the drug to their chickens, putting it right into their water supply, and now the virus that has emerged from Asia is completely resistant to the entire class of drugs. So you can actually start to see the common threads here, right? I mean, we didn't learn our lesson from SARS and close down these live animal markets, and now it's come back to haunt us with H5N1. The new foodborne diseases continue to emerge, yet we continue down this path to greater intensification. We invented industrial poultry production. We invented this practice of fattening chickens with antibiotics. Right? And antibiotic-resistant superbugs arose. We had our warning, yet we kept doing it. We keep doing it. And now, look where we are. The chickens have come home to roost. So, one drug class left, the so-called neuraminidase inhibitors typified by oseltamivir, also known as Tamiflu. Unfortunately, there is not enough to go around. As of mid-2006, we have enough for 2% of the American population. Everyone else is kind of out of luck. There are, however, scattered stocks of this drug still available in U.S. pharmacies, and Secretary Leavitt, who bears ultimate responsible for the fact that we only have enough for 2% of Americans, whereas many Western European countries have 10 times more of their citizens covered. But he was asked if he had himself any Tamiflu at home in his medicine cabinet. He replied, "I have a blister pack of 10 with me." Most people in the world, though, will just have hygiene measures to deal with the next pandemic. In 1918, half of the world's population fell ill, got infected with this virus. Now you can think about that two ways. The kind of the half-empty interpretation is of an unthinkably contagious virus. Half the world infected? Kind of the half-full interpretation, though, is that, look, fully half of humanity escaped infection completely. So you get the flu two ways. Direct contamination, from these respiratory droplets being in a crowded room, confined space, or indirect contamination. This is direct contamination. Droplets of liquid mucus propelled it up to 100 miles an hour, the speed of a Nolan Ryan Guinness Book fastball in 74. Cough snot droplets, 75 miles an hour. As Science in 1918 put it, spit spreads death. Coughs and sneezes spread diseases as dangerous as poison gas shells indeed during a pandemic. So, cover your cough, but do it right. This is wrong. When we cough and cough, we enslime our hand with virus, which we then place on every doorknob, light switch, elevator button, gas pump handle, and then the virus just waits for up to 48 hours under the right circumstances for someone else to touch that same doorknob and then touch their face, and then they are infected as well. Only, I'm afraid, in a post-pandemic world will there be the political will to say, wait a second, what's the true cost of cheap chicken? Thank you.
I want everybody to know Dr. will be speaking this Saturday at McCoy Pavilion. The topic is going to be transitioning toward a vegetarian or plant-based diet. And he's a wonderful speaker himself. So thank you very much. Drive safely, everyone. And the books are available out front. And don't I feel embarrassed having this voice in this topic? Thank you very much.
This program is brought to you by the Vegetarian Society of Hawaii, a nonprofit organization dedicated to sharing with the community the many benefits of a vegetarian diet. Free monthly meetings include vegetarian experts found locally and on the mainland, quick and easy cooking demonstrations, and healthful and delicious food samples. Members enjoy an informative quarterly newsletter, social activities, and discounts at many vegetarian-friendly restaurants and health food stores. For an application, call 944-8344. That's 944-8344. Or visit our website at www.vsh.org. vsh.org.